pleasure to introduce my colleague and recent collaborator, Kristine Rose-Beers, ACR, the head of conservation at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, and an accredited member of the Institute of Conservation. She specializes in the conservation of Islamic manuscript material, with particular interest in the importance of materiality and codicology to contemporary conservation solutions. Kristine has taught and lectured internationally and is a regular tutor at the Montefiascone project in Italy. She is also a member of the Institute of Conservator Restorers in Ireland and a member of the board of directors of the Islamic Manuscript Association. So without further ado, I pass the floor to her.
Great. Well, good morning and good afternoon to those of you who are also over here in Europe. It's my pleasure to join you for this virtual conference. Today, I'd like to start by taking a bit of a step back to address what happens before an item can be analysed. Yesterday, we heard some really wonderful papers, and this morning too, about data collection and processing. But as a manuscript conservator, I'm often closely involved in the processes that happen before an item can be imaged. Henry's presentation also yesterday gave such an excellent understanding of the detailed preparation that is undertaken by conservators to facilitate researchers, digitisation, and MSI. So today I'd like to talk about a particularly challenging case study. Chester Beatty PMA5 is a late antique Manichean manuscript text block. The precise date is subject to much discussion, and I'm sure Paul could tell us a lot more about that later. Made of papyri folios, it is one of 7 Manichean manuscripts said to have been uncovered in a wooden chest in the ruins of an old house near Medinet Mahdi in Egypt in 1929. The collection was subsequently purchased and divided between Sir Alfred Chester Beatty and Carl Smith, a representative of the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin, in 1930 and 1931. The Manichean religion was founded in Mesopotamia in the 3rd century by the prophet Mani. Mani saw the world as a battle between the forces of light and dark. He borrowed from Zoroastrian, Buddhist, and Christian teachings and considered his doctrine to be a unification and clarification of all existing religions. Despite a rapid rise, the Manichean faith was widely persecuted and eventually so successfully suppressed that until the discovery of these books, it was known only through the writings of its oppressors. The Medinet Mahdi manuscripts are one of the earliest and most important collections documenting this now extinct religion, and its discovery has been likened to the cultural and historic significance of the Nag Hammadi codices or Dead Sea Scrolls. Chester Beatty PMA5 is estimated to be perhaps as many as 200 folios of Mani's Living Gospel, the most important of the 7 canonical works composed by the prophet Mani. And this is the manuscript in some of the packaging material that it arrived in at the Chester Beatty many years ago. After their acquisition, PMA5 and the 6 other Manichean manuscripts were sent to the German conservator Dr. Hugo Ibscher for treatment in Berlin. Ibscher worked on the manuscripts for 8 years, from 1930 to 1938. His work is easily identified by the white tape and white tape painted red used to seal the glass plates in which he housed the individual sheets of papyrus as he separated them. He works mechanically, without any aqueous treatment, painstakingly lifting fragments from the block and realigning them accurately on the glass support. By 1939, 2 of Beatty's manuscripts and a selection of other pages had been conserved and transported to London, where Beatty was based at the time. The outbreak of World War II that same year led to immense disruption and confusion concerning the correct identity and ownership of the remaining manuscripts, as they were moved from pillar to post in Germany in efforts to keep them safe, but that also is another story. In 1948, Ibscher's son, Rolf, petitioned Beatty to allow him to continue his father's work. Unfortunately, Rolf was perhaps not quite as skilled or cautious as his father. Indeed, he proceeded to separate folios from PMA5, which his father had previously declared unconservable. Rolf also adopted the new materials, perspex and sellotape, rather than glass and gummed linen, to house the individual folios as his father had done before him. This has created static and distortion, whilst the sellotape has begun to fail, allowing the fragments to slip and fragment in their perspex enclosures. In later years, Rolf also employed an unidentified coating to aid the consolidation of leaves, which has subsequently caused them to darken and distort. Rolf continued to work for Beatty until 1956. Between the father and son, a total of 174 folios were removed from the text block of PMA 5, of which 31 remain in Berlin, whilst a further 143 are held at the Chester Beatty in Dublin. What remains of PMA 5 now is in truly dreadful condition. Melded together by centuries of environmental fluctuations and neglect, the text block has clearly suffered severe water damage, suggestive of a resting place along the Nile floodplain, and it has been subject to the migration of salt crystals and mud throughout the papyrus fibres. Now lovingly known as the sod of turf, PMA 5 in fact rather resembles a small fibrous doormat. It is exceedingly friable, vulnerable to loss with even the slightest vibration, and utterly inaccessible to readers. Although text is visible on the uppermost surface of the manuscript, it is abraded and faint. Thankfully, initial MSI and XRF investigations by Ira Rabin, Ivan Shevchuk, and Olivier Bonnerat from the University of Hamburg proved extremely successful at identifying and then revealing the iron gall ink. This confirmed the efficacy of undertaking further imaging. In the summer of 2017, Paul, one of our conveners here today, got in touch with the Chester Beatty to ask if we would be willing to meet with Dr. Brent Seals from the University of Kentucky. Paul and Brent had been working together as part of the Revealing the Invisible Library project to image a fused parchment codex of the Coptic Acts of the Apostles at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, Morgan M910. We heard a little about it earlier. Paul felt that their experience with the Morgan manuscript might be directly applicable to the Chester Beatty sod of turf. And as such, Brent and his team made plans to visit the Chester Beatty in summer 2018 to take an initial look at the manuscript and to determine possible strategies for imaging it. This meeting saw two notable outcomes. Firstly, that if a non-invasive approach to reading the text of PMA 5 was to be used, it would require very high resolution imaging at a synchrotron facility in order to determine the compact layers of papyrus and small ink characters. And secondly, that if this were to be possible, the manuscript would have to be made fit for travel. Although synchrotron or light source technology itself can be non-destructive and non-invasive, it works by producing exceptionally intense beams of X-rays, ultraviolet and infrared light. As we have heard, it is not a portable technique, or not often. There are synchrotron facilities around the world, but they are much in demand and very expensive to access. Thankfully, a peer-reviewed proposal was submitted to the Diamond Light Source in Oxfordshire for the imaging of PMA 5, and it was successfully granted, allowing us beam time. However, this was just the first part of the challenge. In order to facilitate the analysis of PMA 5 at the Diamond Light Source, the manuscript would have to be safely transported from the Chester Beatty in Dublin across the Irish Sea to the synchrotron in Oxfordshire, UK. As such, a packing solution was sought which would mitigate the risk of damaging vibrations during transportation and enable the manuscript to stand vertically for analysis. Although as conservators we're well used to preparing fragile manuscripts for travel and loan, the prospect of packing PMA 5 was rather daunting, and we all entered discussions with the precursor that analysis would only go ahead if we were confident that the manuscript could travel without damage. The manuscript would also need to be fully supported during the process of X-ray tomography. As the beam is immovable, the manuscript would have to stand vertically and, as we've heard, endures slow, sustained rotation on a mechanized platform in the beam hutch. Human intervention, or indeed first-hand monitoring, would not be possible due to the radiation emitted by the highly energized beam of electrons over many hours of exposure. In addition to this, PMA5 had been stored on a plate of glass for as long as any of us were aware. The density of this glass would dramatically impact the success of imaging, as the best results are obtained when the synchrotron beam passes through an evenly dense medium in all 360 degrees of rotation. In the event that we managed to remove the sod of turf from its glass bed, how would we be able to stand it vertically? There followed much discussion, sleepless nights, and investigation. My colleague Jessica Baldwin and I contacted colleagues, reviewed papers, and rather quickly realised that none of our usual packing methods would suffice. The manuscript was simply too fragile and too weak to support even its own weight. It was at this point that we contacted John Gillis, friend and senior conservator at Trinity College, Dublin. John undertook the conservation of the Fadden Psalter, a unique waterlogged parchment conglomerate manuscript dated to around 800 AD. Found in a peat bog in Ireland's Midlands, and now held by the National Museum of Ireland, the Fadden Psalter was an unimaginable challenge to preserve. Since its discovery in July 2006, the Fadden Psalter had been subject to sustained research and preservation efforts. As only the second known example of parchment recovered from an archaeological context, the Psalter required a highly innovative treatment plan to ensure its preservation. After its initial excavation and removal of the most significant peat deposits, John developed a strategy to dry the saturated parchment folios without shrinkage or darkening. Using solvents and vacuum packaging, he was able to control the drying of the folios, clean them, and finally rehouse the fragile manuscript fragments in inert vacuum-sealed enclosures. After discussing his approach in more detail, we felt that vacuum packaging could provide a workable solution for PMA5. In order to test this approach, I first hired a vacuum packing machine from Conservation by Design. The ArchiPress 1000 offers controlled vacuum settings and was, within reason, portable enough to travel to our lab in Ireland. It was still big enough to hold the manuscript. Next, I needed to produce manuscript substitutes that I could use to test the approach. A combination of orchid compost, doormat fibres, and a small amount of flour, all completely saturated with water, vigorously mixed together and slowly baked in the oven to desiccate, provided the most friable and least accommodating substrate that I was looking for. Initial tests worked well and allowed me to refine the choice of packing materials within the enclosure. Additionally, I was able to open the experimental enclosures to evaluate the impact on the samples they contained. Although the sound of the vacuum being pulled was quite shocking and the sealed enclosures looked rather unremarkable, the soft, even vacuum pressure applied enough hold across the samples to hold them safely in place, but without crushing them. What you can see in this image is the pseudo sod of turf. It's contemporary papyrus just didn't do the job. It wasn't friable enough. Below it is what happens if you simply provide one barrier layer and wrap that facsimile within the vacuum packer. You can see it sort of conforms to every indentation. And then this is, on the left of the screen, is the enclosure with packing layers to sort of spread the pressure of the vacuum. As the internal structural integrity of PMA5 could not be known, and visual access during packaging, transportation, and analysis was not essential, opaque support materials were selected to further protect the manuscript. The recto and edges of PMA5 had already been digitized, so these would provide the information necessary to maintain registration of the text whilst data from imaging was collected. 30-gram bondina, a non-woven polyester material with an extremely smooth surface, was selected as a support, and 7mm black plastazote, a cross-linked close-cell polythene nitrogen expanded foam, was selected as a secondary support and cushion for the bondina-wrapped manuscript. These layers served to disperse the vacuum pressure during enclosure. Finally, we used an anti-static gun to dissipate any static that might exist from all of these materials. To ensure the optimal stability of PMA5 within a vacuum sealed enclosure, we used Escal film recommended by John Gillis. Escal film is specifically designed for the long-term storage of museum objects within a vacuum environment and was thoroughly investigated by John during his PhD research on the conservation of the Fadden Moor. The inner layer of Escal is polypropylene, whilst the outer barrier layer is a vacuum-deposited ceramic on a PVA substrate. The film has known oxygen permeability and water vapor transmission, keeping the enclosure content stable for at least 50 years. In parallel to these trials, Seth Parker, Research Project Manager for the Digital Restoration Initiative at the University of Kentucky, was corresponding with me in order to produce a 3D printed nylon 12 case for the manuscript once it was enclosed. This would allow the manuscript to be safely mounted in a controlled environment before it was moved to the secure hutch at the synchrotron facility and to be safely attached to the scanning plinth during analysis. Just as importantly, the production of a multi-chambered cylindrical case would allow additional packing material to be easily added or removed around the manuscript in order to produce this even density as the enclosure was rotated through 360 degrees. This would lead to a better CT scan, which would be highly beneficial for the Kentucky team processing the data. And so, the day of reckoning was fast approaching. On 15th of August last year, I arrived at work early and prepared my bench ready to encapsulate the sod of turf. I liaised with our director to go over my plan of action one last time and asked my colleagues to assist in different ways. John Reardon, the museum's digital photographer, was on hand to capture the entire process for posterity. With everything set, I closed the door to the conservation lab and moved the manuscript to my bench. Firstly, I assessed where I would be able to make contact with the manuscript in order to push it off the glass support. I had already decided I would use clean, bare hands for this job to ensure maximum sensitivity to every nuance of the manuscript. I identified 2 areas of matted fibres on the right-hand edge of the manuscript and proceeded to push the manuscript from these points. And nothing happened. It was clear that the manuscript would not move without a further catalyst, so I raised the long edge of the glass by 30 mil and tried again. After a few seconds, the text blocks moved and began to slide onto the prepared Mondina and Plastazote support. In total, this process took just 1 minute, but I can assure you it felt like a lifetime. Left on the glass was a layer of Nile mud and debris, but not papyrus. Just 3 small fibres of papyri were visible around the plate. With the text block removed from the glass, I took a moment to collect my thoughts before proceeding with the final encapsulation. The Bondina was gently folded over the manuscript to fully enclose the text block, and a sheet of Plastazote was rested on top of the wrapped block. Next, the ends of the Bondina were folded over the Plastazote to close the package. Working with my colleague Julia Poirier, I then carefully slipped the wrapped manuscript into a pre-prepared Escal film enclosure using a 100% cotton mount card support. This was in fact the slowest part of the process, taking around 5 minutes to get the manuscript and packaging safely into the envelope. It was painstaking, but once the manuscript was in position, I removed the card support and moved the manuscript package in its entirety to the chamber of the Archipress 1000 vacuum machine. The lid of the vacuum machine was closed, and a soft vacuum was pulled for 10 seconds before the final open edge of the enclosure was sealed. At this point, the chamber popped open, and all of us in the lab admired the completely underwhelming sight of a vacuum encapsulated late antique manuscript text block. Now, I am hopeful that I can play this for you. This is accelerated a little. We had done so many run-throughs, using so many maquettes that by this point we were pretty comfortable using the setup. The absence of sound is quite beneficial. And there you go. There's no way around it. Months of work, anticipation and planning culminated in a single nondescript vacuum package, 380 by 288 millimeters in size, containing a manuscript just 324 by 213 by 14 mil. A small identification mark of 2 hatched lines was drawn in permanent marker on the top right-hand corner of the sealed enclosure to mark the head edge of the object's recto. Although the manuscript is not visible, it was now physically and chemically stable enough for both transportation and X-ray tomography to take place. However, in order to maintain the integrity of the encapsulated manuscript, it was essential that the vacuum was not compromised at any time during transportation or imaging. In its new enclosure, PMA5 was packed in a plastizote-lined phase box and prepared for transportation to the UK. On arrival at the Diamond Light Source facility, the manuscript was removed from its travel case and transferred to Seth's carefully produced 3D printed case. Next, it was moved to the beamline hutch and secured on the plinth for analysis. After the rigours of encapsulating the manuscript, transporting it and mounting it at the Diamond Light Source was remarkably straightforward. From a conservator's point of view, everything went as well as it could, and the manuscript was safely returned to the Chester Beatty after analysis without incident. The vacuum seal held, and the manuscript remains safely enclosed until such a time as we feel it is sensible to remove it. The current enclosure allows the manuscript text block to be turned, moved, and handled without direct contact or risk of loss. It is also completely reversible and can be removed without detriment to the manuscript as necessary. In terms of analysis, the manuscript presented just as many challenges as expected. The dimensions of the text block challenged the need for an even density cylinder, so we packed out Seth's mount with printer paper. The matted and fibrous papyrus substrate presents a challenging texture when attempting to differentiate between tightly packed layers and closely written text. And the mountains of data generated by our beam time require a virtual forklift to move. However, we are delighted that we were able to facilitate this request for analysis and undertake a challenging preservation treatment in the process. Whether or not Paul, with the help from the Kentucky team, will be able to read the unreadable and unconservable sod of turf remains to be seen, but I am hopeful. I thought you might like to see a video of that 1 minute of truth, so if you'll bear with me, I'll try and play it. I felt like you could cut the silence on that morning. And you can see it didn't really give. It was quite amazing. It was just so dense and matted.
Okay. We've done it. Okay. Great. Woo! Let's not do that on a regular basis. Jeez.
Oh, it wasn't recording, so we do it again.
Not.
Thank you.